I'm Audrey Grant, and I'm 34 years old. Christmas Eve was supposed to be the night my family found out they were finally getting a grandchild. Instead, it turned into the night. My own Durng Silas looked me straight in the eye across the dinner table and erased me from his life with one sentence. The house was full of polished silverware, expensive wine, and fake smiles. I waited until everyone had taken a bite of prime rib, set my fork down, and said as calmly as I could, "I'm pregnant." For half a second, no one moved. My mother Sarah's hand froze around her glass. My sister Brittany stared at me like she was watching a movie. Silas leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes cold, in a way I'd never seen before. He didn't ask who the father was. He didn't ask if I was happy or healthy. He didn't ask anything. He just said a few quiet, careful words about my baby that I won't repeat here. Then added, "You are not part of this family anymore. You are out of the will." That was it. Years of doing everything right, wiped out between the salad and dessert. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I reached under my chair, took the small, perfectly wrapped present I had brought just for him, and set it in the middle of the table. Then I pushed back my chair, wished everyone a Merry Christmas, and walked out of that house. Before I tell you what he said next, and what he did when he opened that box, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I drove back to my studio apartment in a haze of clinical detachment. The cold air of Boston usually bit through my coat. But that night, I felt nothing. As a bank risk analyst, I deal with toxic assets every day. But I hadn't realized I was living with a portfolio of them for 34 years. I sat at my desk, the silence of the room amplifying the ringing in my ears. Then, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from an app I rarely checked. My sister, Brittany, had accidentally added me to a group chat titled, "Real Family Only." I started scrolling. 847 messages spanning 7 years. It was a digital archive of my own erasure. They called me the charity case. They placed bets, actual money, on how long my marriage would last before it inevitably collapsed. My own mother, Sarah, had written that she was relieved I didn't have kids because it was one less grandchild to worry about. Every time I had shown up for them, every time I had stayed late to help Grandma Martha with her finances, or driven Silas to his appointments, they were laughing behind a screen. I didn't break down. In my line of work, emotion is just bad data in an audit. And I had just discovered a massive discrepancy. I spent the next 4 hours screenshotting every single line. I archived them methodically, labeling the files with the same precision I use for high-risk corporate accounts. I realized then that I had been caught in a house of cards. People often wonder why someone like me, successful, independent, analytical, would stay in a situation that clearly devalued her for so long. It's called the invisible chain of the survivor. When you grow up in a house where love is a currency you can never quite earn, you develop a survival strategy of overperformance and extreme patience. You tell yourself that if you just do a little more, if you stay a little quieter, the people who are supposed to protect you will finally see your worth. But the truth is, a cage without bars is still a cage. And my silence hadn't been weakness, it had been the only way I knew how to stay standing while being eroded from the inside. But as the sun began to rise over the harbor, that strategy died. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a risk analyst looking at a liability that needed to be liquidated. I noticed a thread from 6 months ago where Brittany mentioned a whisper campaign they had started among our mutual social circles in Boston. They were telling everyone I was mentally unstable and spending through my savings after the divorce, all to ensure that if I ever spoke up, no one would believe me. They thought they had buried me. They forgot that, as an analyst, I don't just find the dirt, I map exactly where the bodies are hidden. I typed one message into the group chat, "Thanks for the receipts." Then, I left the group and began the real work. I didn't waste another second on tears. In my world, if an investment doesn't yield a return, you cut your losses and move on. I shifted into high gear, using every skill I'd honed as a risk analyst to perform a full-scale audit of the people who called me a charity case. Over the next few weeks, I worked in a blur of focused precision. I didn't just go to my office, I lived inside the data. 3 weeks of forensic digging, 5 years of tax records, and one major realization later. The winner effect was in full swing. The irony was breathtaking. While Silas and Brittany were busy mocking my single life and my career, I discovered I was actually the invisible engine, keeping their world from stalling out. I had been the one quietly covering the property taxes for our family estate in Boston, totaling over $40,000 to keep it from being seized. I had been the one secretly funding Brittany's influencer lifestyle through an offshore account I managed for Grandma Martha. An account my sister assumed was just a family perk. They wanted to mock my worth as a woman because I didn't have children or a husband. What they didn't know was that I had been a lead donor for a local Boston orphanage for the past 3 years, contributing over $50,000 under a pseudonym. My value wasn't tied to a wedding ring or a lineage they valued. It was in the silent power I held over their very existence. I tracked every dollar of Sarah's credit card debt I'd cleared. I mapped out every loan Silas had taken from Grandma Martha that I'd had to restructure to keep him out of bankruptcy. By the time I finished, I wasn't just Audrey, the disappointment. I was the majority stakeholder in their survival. They had spent years overdrawing my compassion, and I was about to freeze their accounts permanently. I stared at the final balance sheet on my monitor and felt a cold, sharp sense of clarity. The audit was complete. The liability was massive, and it was time for the final reckoning. The deeper I dug into the numbers, the more the spreadsheets began to look like a crime scene. I called up Brandon, a high-stakes corporate attorney I'd known for a decade. He was the kind of person who didn't care about family loyalty, only about the chain of custody. We sat in his glass-walled office, the Boston skyline sharp and cold behind him. As we finalized the audit, one click, and the kill shot data flashed on the screen. It was a transfer of $1,500,000 from a trust fund set up for my career. The signatures were perfect, except for one thing, a slight tremor in the loop of the Y that I only do when I'm exhausted. I hadn't been exhausted that day. I hadn't been there at all. They forged it. "Audrey," Brandon said, his voice as flat as a judicial sentence. "Your mother and Silas drained the account and then spent 2 years telling Grandma Martha that you'd squandered the money on a lavish lifestyle after your divorce. They weren't just ungrateful, they were criminals. They had stolen my future to pay for their present, then used the theft to paint me as the family failure. It was the ultimate leverage. I didn't call them. I didn't send a warning. Instead, I waited for the arrogance trap to spring. 3 weeks later, the invitation arrived. It was for Grandma Martha's 80th Golden Anniversary Gala, an elite black tie event at the family's coastal mansion. But my invitation had a special handwritten note from Brittany. Theme: Nung Tri Farm Casual. We wanted you to feel comfortable, since you don't really do the high society thing anymore. I stared at the note, feeling a cold, transactional sense of irony. They wanted to humiliate me one last time. To have me stand in a denim jacket while the rest of the Boston elite wore tuxedos and gowns. They thought my silence for the last few weeks was surrender. They thought I was a beaten dog coming back for scraps. I called the venue's AV manager. I didn't tell him I was the disappointing daughter. I told him I was the lead analyst managing the commemorative presentation for Martha Grant. I sent him the files, not the childhood photos they expected, but the 847 messages and the forensic bank audits. "I'll be there." I texted the group chat, And I'm bringing a gift that none of you will ever forget. I spent the rest of the evening reviewing the legal citations for fraud. The trap was set. The stage was high stakes. And for the first time in 34 years, I was the one holding the gavel. The Boston mansion was a fortress of glass and arrogance that evening. I arrived exactly 10 minutes late. Wearing the farm casual denim and boots my mother had insisted on. As I stepped into the ballroom, the silence that followed me was deafening. I was a stain of indigo in a sea of black silk and white diamonds. I saw Silas at the far end of the room, raising a glass of vintage champagne to a group of investors. His face glowing with the self-assurance of a man who believed he'd finally won. Beside him, Brittany was preening for a photographer, her influencer smile wide and hollow. "Audrey, you actually came," Sarah said, appearing at my side with a look of feigned pity that didn't reach her eyes. She leaned in, her voice a sharp whisper. "I told you casual. But this? You look like the help. Try to stay in the corners. Please. This is an important night for your sister." I didn't argue. I just smiled a cold, analytical smile that she was too arrogant to read correctly. I watched them take the stage. Silas and Brittany standing under the spotlight to deliver their tribute to Grandma Martha. They spoke of integrity, family loyalty, and legacy. Silas even had the audacity to mention me, pointing to the back of the room. "We all have family members who lose their way," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But the Grant family is a sanctuary. We carry the burdens of those who can't carry themselves." The crowd murmured with polite, misplaced sympathy. Brittany dabbed her eyes, playing the role of the supportive sister to perfection. They thought their power was an inherent right. But they were about to learn the difference between having and being. You see, their entire social standing was a rented facade, paid for by the very person they were currently disparaging. Their power was, have something external. A layer of paint over a V-rung, an empty wallet of a soul. When that paint is stripped away, there is no being underneath to keep them upright. I moved toward the AV booth. The manager nodded to me, his hand hovering over the play button. I checked the room one last time. Grandma Martha was sitting in the front row, her silver hair gleaming, her expression unreadable. She deserved the truth. Time for the presentation. I whispered into the headset. The ballroom lights dimmed to a deep, expectant blue. The 20-foot projection screen behind Silas and Brittany flickered to life. But it wasn't a slideshow of Martha's childhood. The first thing that hit the screen was a giant, high-resolution screenshot of the group chat from 2 years ago. Megan, Cece's getting divorced. Aunt Linda, no way. Finally, I knew it. Pay up, ladies. $50 each. The silence in the ballroom became a living thing. Silas froze, his hand still gripping the microphone as his own words, mocking my career and betting on my failure, began to scroll past in slow motion for every elite guest in Boston to see. The digital scroll was a relentless, slow-motion demolition. Every micro-detail of their betrayal was now broadcast in high definition. The room was so silent, you could hear the soft hum of the projector and the shallow, panicked breathing of the two people trapped on stage. Next came the evidence of the real family-only chat. A message from my mother, Sarah, flashed on the screen. At least she doesn't have kids. One less grandchild to worry about. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I watched the sweat bead on Silas's brow as the weapon of data moved from words to numbers. I projected the bank audits I'd spent weeks compiling. The screen displayed the truth in stark black and white. September 12th. Tuition fee. $40,000. Paid by Audrey Grant. October 15th. Estate property taxes. $45,000. Paid by Audrey Grant. The elite guests. The very people Silas and Brittany had spent years trying to impress. were now leaning forward in their seats. They weren't looking at the golden child anymore. They were looking at a fraud. Then came the kill shot. The screen flickered, showing the $1,500,000 trust fund transfer. I zoomed in on the forged signature. Beside it, I displayed my actual signature from my bank risk analyst credentials. The discrepancy was undeniable. The words "forgery detected" appeared in red letters across the 20-foot screen. Silas's microphone hissed as he tried to speak, his voice cracking like dry wood. This is a misunderstanding. Audrey is unstable. She's obsessed. Brittany tried to laugh, but it came out as a strangled sob. They were staking their entire reputation on a lie that had just been incinerated by data. Grandma Martha stood up. At 80 years old, she still commanded the room with a spine like steel. She didn't look at the stage, she looked at me in my denim jacket. Then, she turned to the guests. "I have been writing things down for 10 years. Grandma said, her voice carrying more power than the speakers ever could. She pulled out her own iPad, syncing it to the screens. "I know who showed up for the cardiology appointments. I know who cleaned this house when I was too weak to move." She scrolled through her journal dates, times, and specific acts of care that were never posted on Instagram. Silas, Sarah, Brittany. You have been living on the labor of the one person you dared to call a charity case. You didn't just steal her money, you tried to steal her dignity. Grandma Martha looked at Uncle Brandon, her attorney, who stepped forward with a folder. Effective immediately. All family assets and access to the Grant Investment Fund are frozen. I am initiating a criminal investigation into the misappropriation of $1,500,000. The power flip was absolute. Sarah collapsed into her chair, her black tie elegance dissolving into a mess of mascara and panic. Brittany's phone was buzzing not with likes, but with the sound of her followers vanishing in real time as the gala's live stream caught every word. Grandma Martha held out her hand to me. "Audrey, come here. From this moment on, you are the sole director of the Grant Foundation. You have earned this. Not by blood, but by being the only real family in this room." I walked past my mother and Silas, who were now effectively invisible to their own guests. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of a legacy finally finding its rightful owner. The harbor air was crisp as I stood on the balcony of my new office, the skyline of Boston reflecting in the glass. The dust has finally settled on the wreckage of my old life. My mother and Silas were forced to move into the exact same run-down apartment complex they had mocked me for living in years ago. Brittany's social media career didn't just stall, it imploded. Every brand deal was cancelled, and she's currently working a telemarketing job, realizing that an influencer with a public record for forgery isn't exactly a hot commodity. As for me, I didn't find my peace in the money, but in the silence that followed. I spent my first month as director of the Grant Foundation auditing more than just accounts. I audited my own heart. I realized that I had spent 34 years setting myself on fire just to keep them warm. No more. I recently sent a final letter to those who still follow my story. Specifically to those of you who have ever felt like the invisible one. It's a message I carry with me every day now. You are not a phase. And you are certainly not a charity case in your own existence. If your family only sees your worth when they need something from you, they aren't your real family, they are just people you share DNA with. Grandma Martha is still in the garden, notebook in hand. But she isn't just keeping track of medications anymore. She's helping me build a legacy that actually matters, a foundation for marginalized women in finance to ensure they never have to be invisible survivors. I've learned that the best revenge isn't the explosion at the gala. It's the quiet morning when you wake up and realize you don't need anyone's permission to be seen. You have the power to write your own ending. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, know that you are enough exactly as you are. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And hit that subscribe button for more stories of justice.